Thank you, Brian. That was a very interesting introduction. So it was well done. That was a killer introduction. Thank you for being here this afternoon, and greatly appreciate it. Just a show of hands, how many of you represent let's call it vendor side of things, whether you're a research firm, a magazine, a media supplier? Okay, very good. How many of you represent destinations or attractions? All right, very good. And how many of you represent other? All right, very good. Now this is supposed to be, it said on the agenda that this was a shirt sleeve session. I have no idea what that meant. And since Brian came wearing a coat and tie, I immediately went back up to my room and changed because I didn't want Mr. Sharp over here to outclass me. This is a little bit of an unusual session in that I've never seen it presented before, and it's been a topic that's interested me for a while. And yes, this is a session that Brian, as head of CETRA, initiated. And by the way, CETRA does a really good job in the spring meeting as well with SCS. The combined meeting has some really good sessions, so be sure to come back for that meeting, which will be in Lexington in March. This is not just for marketing research, though. There's a lot of the stuff that you'll see here is applicable to marketing research, but a lot of the principles hopefully can be transferred to other types of requests for services, whether it's advertising and other marketing communication services, website development, even other services that you might request in travel and tourism industry. Also, too, if you're on the vendor side, and I hesitate using that because it's such a catch-all phrase, but if you're on the vendor side, hopefully there will be some things that you can learn and that you have learned and can share later on when we get into questions and answers today. I really want you to try to have one single objective here, which is to craft RFPs that will generate more responses from more qualified firms, which is actually more of an issue than you might think. We'll talk about that. That will generate better responses from responding firms and will generate better results for you in the end in terms of whether it's a marketing research initiative, an advertising initiative, that hopefully by doing a better RFP, it will lead to all three of these. Now, I sort of stumbled into this by accident. I started my consulting firm about 9.5 years ago, and I had only been doing it for a month, and I had a pretty good idea of what it was I wanted to concentrate upon as a consultant. And I got a phone call from a friend of mine who said, I really need someone to manage this process for me and to write an RFP. I don't have time to do it, and I think you'd be the perfect person to do this. And I said, okay, I never thought about it before, but you know, hey, I'm sitting around waiting for the phone to ring. This makes sense, I'll try it. And I liked it. That was the scary part, which, you know, building off of Brian's introduction, that's pretty geeky of me, I realized, to actually like writing an RFP. But as a consultant, I'm on both sides of the aisle, and I have done a number of things as someone who has written RFPs, but also responded to them. And so I've had proposals rejected for completely arbitrary, capricious reasons by clients, potential clients. I've had prospects ignore me during presentations. I've lost business to local competitors. I've lost business to out-of-town competitors. I've had phone calls and emails go unanswered. I've also not returned phone calls and emails. I've eagerly responded to dumb, poorly written RFPs with hopeless deadlines, which we're going to change that today. I've stayed up all night to complete said proposals, and I've been told that price wasn't a factor, and then later told price was the reason that I didn't get the job. And those of you who have on the vendor side have probably had all of these things happen to you. Really, though, the impetus for this was really about 3 or 4 years ago. The calendar says February 2013, but that's just an example. When I decided to respond to an RFP from a destination out in the western part of the U.S. And they had a deadline of 8:30 a.m. Mountain Standard Time on a Tuesday. So I said, okay, pretty straightforward RFP. So my proposal goes out on Friday, send it out FedEx. It arrives on Monday the 18th. However, Monday the 18th is unfortunately President's Day. The presentation did not sit on this government institution's doorstep. There was no front porch for it to sit on, and it required a signature. And as a result, it didn't get delivered until after 8:30 the next day, which meant that the proposal was rejected. And I felt really, really good about my chances of winning this RFP. Really, really good. And I called up the administrator of this, and I said, what's the purpose of having an 8:30 a.m. deadline for an RFP? It was obvious that it was intended for somebody locally. And they hadn't thought through, well, how's an out-of-town firm going to respond to this? And yes, I probably should have sent it out on Thursday, but how many days in advance of the deadline would that have been? And I thought at that time, gosh, this is a really stupid way to go about doing business. And the fact that someone had an 8:30 a.m. deadline at a place that was 2,000 miles away from where I had been asked to respond to this RFP. They sent it to me. I thought, there's got to be a better way of doing this. So as I've gone through and worked with my clients, I've tried to come up with better RFP, better request for proposal processes, and also to think about it as a process that has an end in sight. And that, for me, is probably the most important thing that you can take away from this process today, is that always start with the end in mind. What's your destination, and what do you want to achieve from those results, from what it is as to why you're sending out the RFP in the first place? One of the things I did in preparation for this presentation today is to talk to a number of my friends who are in the travel and tourism research business. And I went and asked them, I said, well, what kinds of proposals or kinds of RFPs do you generally like to respond to? Not because they are easy or because they're lucrative, but what makes the process a good one for you? And this, and one other thing that we'll talk about shortly, was the number one feedback I got, which was more people need to clearly identify and state their business issues and objectives in the RFP, so that it's not just a matter of trying to guess what the client wants. And they feel oftentimes that potential clients are playing games, that they're really trying to game the system, that there's some sort of hidden agenda, or that they don't want to be upfront and direct. So another thing that's very obvious when it comes to looking at the RFP process is how few, particularly governmental-inspired RFPs for destinations and other organizations, don't put the project scope front and center in the RFP. There are some that put it down here. On a 50-page RFP, it'll be buried on page 45 somewhere. And there's all this other stuff that we'll talk about here shortly that's burying the true scope of what it is that the destination or attraction really wants. And yet, this is by far the most important part. And it's the most important thing for a big reason. And that's the importance of selling yourself. Now, unfortunately, most clients, most people on the prospect side, don't think about the RFP as a way of selling themselves. And this is becoming increasingly important because oftentimes those vendors are just as time-starved as you are, okay? They have a lot of stuff that they're doing, and when that RFP comes in the mail or comes via email or they see it posted online, they're looking at just the first couple of pages and trying to decide whether it is that they want to respond to it. There was a cover story in Advertising Age magazine, just to shift gears over to the advertising side, the agency world for a second. There was a cover story in Advertising Age a week ago that talked about the number of agencies now that are no longer pursuing RFPs. And the biggest reason they said why they're not doing it, ridiculous deadlines, just hopelessly preposterous deadlines. And there were a number of other reasons why they're not doing it. But this has become increasingly critical, particularly as the economy has rebounded. Karen, you hopefully can afford to be more selective now in who it is that you want to work with. The research companies are finding the exact same thing. Destinations, attractions, others are now spending more money on research. Budgets have gotten a little looser in post-recession, and they're now able to pick and choose a little bit better who they want to work with. And so they're only scanning the first couple of pages of an RFP. You've got to be able to sell yourself a little bit as a destination, as an organization, as an attraction, in order to get the attention of a prospective qualified vendor, particularly one who's busy. A vendor who's really busy is generally probably doing good work. It stands to reason. Someone who's not getting many phone calls, not getting much activity, they're probably not very good at what they do in the first place. So the thing I want to take away from this is that, like a lot of things in life, people want to do business with people and projects that they like. And if they can afford to be choosy, they will do so. So the RFP is truly, it's an introduction as to who you are. It says an awful lot about who you are as an organization, who you are as a person, and whether or not they want to work with you. So better RFPs, again, get better responses, more qualified firms, and stronger results. I'll also take an example from speed dating, and there's been research done on the effectiveness of speed dating, and that is half of all women make up their mind within 30 seconds of meeting a man about whether he is potential boyfriend material versus 22% of men. And they call us shallow, right? Well, look around the room. We have a majority of women in here, okay, on both the client side and the destination side, the attraction side. You have to think about this as a little bit like speed dating. You've got to be able to capture the attention of a prospective vendor fairly early on in the RFP process. Now, if your RFP is being written by a purchasing side, which is, certainly happens a lot more now than it used to happen, unfortunately, that's a whole different issue. We'll talk about that later. And along those lines, try not to let the lawyers get in the way. In most cases, there's not necessarily an obligation to bloat the RFP full of legalese in the first 3/4 of the RFP. And yet, particularly on the governmental side, and particularly when a purchasing agent is writing the RFP, that's often what happens. And I'm always reminded of the scene from Willy Wonka with this huge thing of legalese that unfortunately buries a lot of the key salient points about the RFP. If you have to include the legalese in the RFP, that's fine. But there's no reason why it can't be placed later on as an appendix or somewhere else. Again, you're out there recruiting for potential firms just as much as they're looking to do business with you. Price. This is something that if you're writing an RFP, everybody struggles with in terms of, well, I don't want to give away my bargaining position here. I want to be able to get the best deal that I can. And in talking with a number of folks on both the client side and on the vendor side, everyone generally tends to agree that exact budget figures are going to limit the creativity of proposals. And particularly in marketing research, certainly on the advertising side and in media, there's an awful lot of options available now, many more options than we've ever had before in terms of how to address a particular business problem or issue. Generally, within an RFP, a budget range will allow for more options and greater flexibility. You really want to try to leverage the expertise and the experience of your vendors as much as possible. But you should also state whether the client is obligated to take the lowest bid. Now, in most cases, even on the governmental side, they're not obligated to take the lowest bid. They do have to at least combine it with some sort of quality score. But there probably are situations in certain cases where it's a very narrowly defined scope within the RFP. They're looking for someone to do a set of focus groups in these markets, and it's very clear as to what the deliverable is. But you should state very clearly whether the client is obligated to take the lowest bid. Another piece of feedback I heard is that in this day and age, multi-year bids for services are really impractical. And there are still people out there asking for things like 3- and 4-year bids to provide services, which in the day and age that we live in with so many changes, is really impractical to do anymore. Playing favorites. One of the things that I heard a lot from in talking with research vendors is that they oftentimes are very frustrated when they find out that the firm had already been selected in advance. And that's understandable. I've certainly probably have been a victim of that as well. In my opinion, it's okay to play favorites if you're completely upfront about it. And this is a really difficult issue, I realize, particularly for those destinations and communities that are at least politically obligated to take a local vendor or an in-state vendor. If you have to distribute an RFP, my recommendation is to clearly state that there's a preferred firm already identified. Now you're saying to yourself, well, that means I'm going to get a lot fewer RFP responses, and that's probably true. But my experience is also, too, that there are still firms that will respond to the RFP in the hopes of changing minds or in the hopes of making an introduction so that maybe they don't get the business this time, but they'll get it the next time around. Also, too, I've found that if there's an incumbent, and many firms will always ask if there's an incumbent, if there's somebody that you're already doing business with, to communicate to interested firms whether the incumbent will be responding as part of the RFP process. And I think that's important, and I think it's fair to let interested firms know that as well. Another recommendation, avoid prescribing precise methodology. Now, particularly on the marketing research side, but it's true in many other things as well. Marketing research continues to evolve, advertising continues to evolve, the media world continues to evolve, and the folks who are in marketing research really have access to the most up-to-date information that they can then apply to your particular business situation. And it may be that you've already spec'd out a particular solution to a problem. You think that this is the way we want to do that. And that's fine, but you should allow for some creativity in the responses as well. You know, one of the things I heard from some of the national research firms I talk with is that there's so much new technology now and so many new tools that allow people to, in many cases, deliver a more efficient response than ever before. This is a really big one for me that I learned the hard way, unfortunately. I'll share some examples of how I learned the hard way. Fundamental thing to put limits on the RFP response. Now, in many cases, you may not need to do that, but the last couple of RFPs I've written, I've included these two paragraphs. Responses should be in a format that is succinct, easy to read, and user-friendly. Responses that use awkward binding, excessively large page dimensions, dim fonts, and outrageously small type will be considered cruel and unusual forms of punishment, or what I refer to as the Bieber-Kardashian effect, okay? So it's amazing if you even say, though, okay, there's a 50-page limit, for instance. It's amazing how much information can be crammed into 50 pages if you really try. That does not do anything in terms of currying favor with the audience that's reading the RFP. It makes it very, very difficult to stand out and really only irritates people. I'll share a few examples with you of other things as to why you need to put some limits. First of all, you don't want to have to send the RFP or the RFP carrier back. I once had an agency respond to an RFP. They enclosed the copies of the RFP response in a door that measured, it was a wooden door with glass that measured 3 feet by 1 foot, okay? This thing was it was very creative, but it was a pain in the butt to have to cart that thing around. And then they called me back 3 months later and wanted to know if they could get it back, which to me was just insane, okay? I wanted to get rid of that thing as soon as it came in the door. No pun intended. And it was a nice idea. It was a great example of creativity, but it was a real burden for me and for the client. Another rule of thumb, don't want it if you can't read it while sitting on the sofa. That's my own personal rule, because usually I get a bunch of these in, and I want to take the time to really focus and spend time. I want my clients to do that as well. So it ought to be in a user-friendly format. And again, if you say that somebody has if you allow someone, for instance, a 50-page limit or 25-page limit, pages is a pretty broad term, and people will take that to mean, oh, a page could be like that, and we've had that happen as well. Reasonable page limits, just speaking of page limits, this really, there's no hard and fast rule there. It really depends on how much information you're asking for. Are you asking for prospective vendors to fill out complete a lot of the legalese and a lot of the contract information in advance? Are you asking them to provide a lot of case examples? Really depends, but I think, and depending on the complexity of what you're asking for in the RFP, there's nothing wrong with having reasonable page limits. This is a question that gets asked a lot now because purchasing agents have become a big part of the process in many cases for many municipal and state entities. And it may not be that purchasing is necessarily the decider, if you will, but it may be, though, that purchasing is the vendor agent that you have to go through to get to marketing or to get to the person who's the decider. So trying to understand ultimately who you're writing that RFP for. Are you writing it for a purchasing agent, or are you writing it for someone who's on the sales and marketing side is really important. Understanding who that end audience is. But making it clear up front to the audience, I think, to the vendor is really, I think, the fairest thing to do. Don't play games there. Client references, fairly simple, fairly straightforward. I always now ask for client references in the RFP response because later on when you're hurrying to try to get things done, when you're trying to wrap up the process, it becomes a hassle to have to look for those. I would recommend asking for references who have been clients for the type of work being requested or who are similar types of clients, okay? Now, for instance, if you're looking for someone to be a qualitative research vendor and to do focus groups for you, asking about or getting someone who's only done quantitative work doesn't really make any sense. So you want to find clients who have done that type of work. Or, let's use advertising example. If you're a destination or you're an attraction, for instance, and you're trying to drive traffic and you want to find an advertising partner, okay, they may not have travel and tourism experience, but perhaps they have retail experience, or perhaps they have experience working with a local sports team, a college or pro team. Those are the kinds of things that may be types of similar type of work. Also ask, how did the firm help solve a problem or drive their business? You want to be able to reach out to a reference and ask them, well, what did this firm do for you? What kind of research process did they do? What was the end result? Were you happy with the process? Were you happy with the end result of the work? And this has actually become a little bit of an issue. It's amazing how many references I call now at the end of the process when we've identified a vendor, we're ready to go to work with them and do business, and they give us references who won't return phone calls or emails, or in some cases have actually moved on to another job, which is very, very frustrating and makes you begin to wonder at the end of the process, after you've identified your perfect firm, well, just what's going on here? Why have they given me the name of this person that's moved on or is no longer in business? A key issue for a lot of vendors is the question of questions and answers. And I've always had a pretty strong philosophy about this that probably runs counter to a lot of people, which is I think the best RFPs allow for questions and answers throughout the process so that right up to the last minute you can ask a question. Because again, if you've got, say, a 4 to 6 week window of opportunity to respond to an RFP, there's a constant process of discovery. You're learning more about that destination or that potential client. You're learning more about who they are. They're learning more about you. And I think the opportunity ought to be there to ask questions and answers throughout the process. Now, I also appreciate that may not be realistic due to time constraints on staff. That's understandable, and so that's why oftentimes there's usually a 2-week period or a 3-week period that allows for the prospective vendor to ask questions and get more information, which I'm not opposed to. I just think, again, limiting it during that time period doesn't give the best, most robust RFP response. I'm not a fan of in-person pre-proposal conferences, particularly mandatory conferences. I think that one, they're usually counterproductive because they usually occur at the very start of the process. And two, mandatory conferences in many cases will limit your potential audience for prospective vendors. If a vendor can easily do the work and they're 1,000 miles away, but they don't want to spend the money to come to a mandatory pre-proposal conference or just can't that day, it makes it difficult. I've been also, as a consultant, I've been in conference calls for mandatory pre-proposal conferences, and it's, usually I'm on the other end and there might be 60 people in the room. It's hard to hear the questions. It's hard to see people's, you can't see people's facial responses or what their emotions are. And unfortunately, too, I always have this idea that if I'm not there as a consultant, I'm getting a black mark next to my name because I didn't make the effort, but my competitor did. Confidentiality, a big issue, particularly if you're a public entity. And laws certainly vary from state to state here. In the RFP, I would encourage you to be very upfront about any type of open records laws. If you're a public entity, if you're receiving public tax money, I think it's important to be upfront about, will proposal responses be made available to the public? And it's interesting to me, in doing some work recently for a client, I was doing, in managing an RFP process for them, I was doing some research on a prospective vendor for this client, and I found where they had responded to an RFP for another destination, and their whole proposal response was online, which really surprised me, but apparently they had to do that. It was part of the public discovery. Also, will presentations, if you require final presentations, will those be open to the public? There are some firms that are really sensitive about sharing their process to potential competitors. Will the identity of respondents be made known other than the final selected firm? I will often get asked, well, how many of the firms received the RFP? Who are the other finalists? And I would never share that information unless the other firms involved didn't have a problem with it. And usually there's one or two who say, I want to remain confidential until the end. This is another thing, too, that's interesting. It's okay to ask for certain financial information, but again, some of the information is privileged and confidential. And I had one research vendor I spoke with who does a lot of work in the travel and tourism sector, who was asked for his social security number. And he thought that was a just terrible breach. And he chose not to respond to it, and he thinks that a lot of other people didn't respond to it because that was just a really terrible breach of security, of confidentiality. I mentioned that there were two big things I heard in talking with research vendors, and even those of you who are not on the research vendor side, who are on the agency side or on the media side, can probably relate very well to this as well, and that's establishing a reasonable RFP schedule. And as I mentioned, this story that appeared last week in Advertising Age that talked about why fewer and fewer agencies are responding to unsolicited RFPs, this was the number one thing, that RFP schedule wasn't reasonable. And I think that you have to have a minimum of 2 weeks for questions if there's a separate period for question and answers, and 4 weeks for proposal response. And I think that's a minimum for getting a good response. One person pointed out too that oftentimes someone in their organization, in their research organization, someone else may receive the RFP. It may take them a while to pass it along to the person who's actually going to respond to it, who's going to write it, or perhaps whose area of specialty or geographic area is really relevant for that. Also, too, one thing I think is really important, make the RFP schedule easy to find within the document. It should be in the email that goes out. It should probably be in the first page or so that people know right away whether they have the bandwidth to be able to respond to it very quickly. Final report. This is oftentimes an overlooked part of the RFP, and yet I know an awful lot of research vendors that really sweat over this part. And since there are a wide variety of options now in providing that final report, I think it's a good idea to spec out in advance and put in the RFP what it is that you want. So do you want an electronic copy? If you want it printed, how many copies? Again, printing's not cheap. And it's oftentimes one of those things that consultants don't necessarily build in at the end. They probably should. How many copies do you want? I have a consultant friend of mine who talks about binders that go thump, that they have clients who are very politically savvy, who go out, spend money on this big master plan or big research project, and they want, at the end of the project, a binder that goes thump when you lay it on the table, so that all of the county commissioners or city council people or other stakeholders and say, wow, that's a really impressive looking document. Now it's stupid, okay? I admit it. But unfortunately, that's the reality of the world that we live in, is that sometimes the client wants a binder that goes thump on the table. Word document versus PowerPoint. Stephanie, years ago, I'll pick on Stephanie for a second, Stephanie Brown from Asheville, our CVB director. Years ago, I asked Stephanie, as someone who is a purchaser of consultant services and market research services, what kind of report do you want? Do you want a written Word document? Do you want a PowerPoint report? Or do you want some sort of hybrid in between? And Stephanie gave me some really good advice. She said, I don't know if this is still true because it was several years ago, but she said, I don't want a PowerPoint report, okay? That just skimps on a lot of the details. Ideally, I'd like to have a written report, but if I have to have a hybrid that merges the two, that's fine as well. And so understanding how much obligation you have at the end, understanding for the vendor how much obligation you want at the end in terms of that report, I think it's important to put that up front. Asking the right questions, and that's really incumbent upon the person who's developing, upon the client or prospect that's developing the RFP. Some of the right questions might be asking about relevant experience. Again, relevant being the key word here. To ask for relevant specific work examples, and if appropriate, the results generated. I think that gives some insight into the mindset of the vendor, whether it's an advertising agency, a marketing research firm, what kind of results were generated for that particular client. Qualifications of key personnel. Ask about the specific person to be assigned to the client's business. Who's the person that you know you can pick up the phone and call and ask when there's problems or if, during the process, if it can get clarification on things. Ask about whether there will be partners or subcontractors involved, which is certainly continues to be a very popular way of doing business. Source of panel respondents, particularly if you're doing quantitative research. There are a lot of sources now for doing online panel research, and some of the folks in this room will tell you that there's a real quality difference between certain panel providers. So you want to know a little bit more about what's the source of panel respondents if they're using online panels. How many years have they been in business? And whether or not there's any pending litigation. That may seem like a strange question, but quite frankly, and I've never had this happen, where I've had someone who said that they were in pending litigation, but that would certainly be a potential red flag for you in dealing with someone like that. One of the last things I'll talk about is the need to clearly establish your criteria. And this really goes back to understanding the end in mind. What's the destination that you want to arrive at? And so how important, for instance, is it that you have work, that the prospective vendor has work in your category? How important is it that they've done work for a destination, for an attraction? Communicating that and understanding how important that is for you is I think, very key. What's their knowledge of current practices? Understanding how in touch they are so that you don't necessarily have to go to another vendor the next time you ask them to solve a particular business question. The ability to provide strategic insight. What kind of pricing and value? Again, you may not be obligated to necessarily choose the lowest cost vendor, but you do want to understand what kind of value they provide for the price. The ability to deliver a customized solution. And This is something that I think is really important. Most of you don't want a cookie cutter approach. Now, there may be purchasing agents out there that you're working with on your side, if you're a municipal or state entity, who don't mind having a cookie cutter approach, but I think it really cheapens the process, it cheapens the work of the people who work in this category. It's also interesting too, we were talking about this beforehand, it's still amazing to me how many vendors of all types will submit a proposal where they haven't changed but a single word, usually the name of the destination, in responding to an RFP. You get somebody else's RFP basically. And we were talking earlier, I received an RFP a number of years ago from a firm, and they hadn't even bothered to go in and change out the other destination to whom they had sent this response. They'd only changed the cover and had forgotten to change all the other things where it said City X. That's unacceptable. That's not the kind of approach you want. So you've got to identify ways of saying, we're looking for somebody who will deliver a customized solution for us. Creativity of the response, that's usually not a factor in travel and tourism research, but certainly you do want somebody, regardless of what kind of vendor you are, who will perhaps think outside the box and offer some options to you that are a little bit different than what you might otherwise expect. And then finally, attention to detail. That's something that as a client you ought to be looking at. It's something if you're a vendor, spell check is a wonderful thing, okay? It's a great thing, but it doesn't catch all errors. And I've been involved with a number of RFP processes where the client took a response and threw it in the trash because there were misspelled words in that. And if you're an advertising agency in particular, that's not what you want to see. Finally, channels of distribution. This is another key question that ought to be answered on the front end, and that is the RFP process going to be open to anybody or only to invited firms? That's a decision you need to make. If you decide, for instance, that you only want to work with a local firm or an in-state firm for something, don't send it out to someone who's out of state or out of your market area. Understanding what your distribution strategy and the methods for that distribution. There's a number of different ways, a number of different online vehicles now. If you're sending out an RFP, to get that RFP in the hands of an awful lot of folks, tools like BidSync, for instance. Brian's daily newsletter, he does a great job actually of distributing RFPs when he knows about them. And you should probably be charging a service for that, or charging a fee for that. So that's a revenue opportunity for you. But Brian's got a great list of decision makers and influencers that he sends out his e-newsletter to. We talked about geographic limitations. Also, too, one other thing you might consider if you've got a fairly lengthy or involved process where you expect a lot of firms to respond is the use of an RFI, request for information, or RFQ, request for qualification stage in advance of the RFP if you're expecting a large number of firms to respond. Just a few other key points, just a few other final points that I think make for really effective RFPs. Table of contents, unless it's just a couple of pages long, table of contents is really helpful again for anybody perusing the RFP on both the vendor side and the client side. An executive summary. Again, remember, you're trying to sell yourself as much as recruiting, as much as trying to get a good response. Brief background on past efforts is something that's really appreciated. If you've done similar research like this, for instance, if you've done a large quantitative project in the past and looking to repeat it, it's helpful to know that. Asking about professional liability insurance, usually not much of an issue. I don't get that many people who ask, that many clients where that's a requirement. But there are some, particularly on the governmental side, that will ask about having professional liability insurance. So if that's important, be sure to ask about that. Declaring whether there will be any compensation of costs for RFP responses. If there's no compensation, I think it's important to state that up front. And then finally, allowing for further negotiation of bids. Unless you've got a purchasing agent who is really rigid and says that the final bid is the final bid and it's going to be sealed bids and separate envelopes, allowing for further negotiation of bids beyond that initial estimate, I think it's really important because it's oftentimes that vendor can't possibly know everything that they want to know about you as a client or about necessarily what your needs are. And so you may get into further discussion with that client, with that prospect, and realize that there are some other things that you could do for that person that hadn't come out initially in the RFP. So again, our objective is to craft request proposals that generate more responses from more qualified firms, that are going to generate better responses from interested firms, and ultimately better results from you. And I think there's a real correlation between having a strong RFP and a great end product. And if you remember nothing else, it's more Lionel and less Bieber and less Kardashian. Thank you very much.